The most theologically educated men in Judea are standing in front of Jesus. They have just watched Jesus heal a man who was blind and mute. Yet moments later, they ask, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." Why does Jesus refuse the most educated people in Judea what he freely gives to blind beggars and bleeding women? This video explores the profound difference between the demand of a Pharisee and the desperation of a leper. We will discover why Jesus will not provide a cosmic sign that removes the need for faith, and why the only sign he offers is the sign of Jonah. The most theologically educated men in Judea are standing in front of Jesus. They are scribes and Pharisees, the interpreters of the law, the custodians of the tradition, the people who have spent their entire adult lives studying the Hebrew scriptures and debating their implications and training others in their application. If anyone in first century Judaism would be equipped to evaluate the claims of a rabbi from Nazareth, it is these men. They know the prophecies. They know what the Messiah is supposed to do. They know the signs that the tradition said would accompany the arrival of the age to come. And they have just watched Jesus heal a man who was blind and mute. They saw it. Matthew records it in the verse immediately before this scene. The man was brought to Jesus, blind and unable to speak, and Jesus healed him. And the crowds were amazed, and the Pharisees said he was doing it by the power of Beelzebul, the prince of demons. A long argument follows. And then, at the end of this exchange, after all of that, some scribes and Pharisees say to Jesus, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." They have just watched a miracle. They want a sign. If that sentence does not stop you, you are reading too fast. These men have witnessed the healing of a blind and mute man moments ago. They are not asking for more evidence because they have no evidence. They are asking for a different kind of evidence, evidence on their terms, in their format, from their preferred location, from heaven, undeniable, the kind that leaves no room for interpretation, no space for the question of whether what you saw means what you think it means, no gap between the demonstration and the conclusion it is supposed to produce. They want a sign that compels assent, and Jesus gives them the most unexpected answer in the entire gospel. We will get there. But first, why does Jesus refuse the most educated, most religiously credentialed, most theologically sophisticated people in Judea what he freely gives to blind beggars and bleeding women and fathers whose daughters have just died? What is the difference between the demand of a Pharisee and the desperation of a leper? That question is what this video is built around. Something has happened to these men long before they arrive in this scene. It has been accumulating across the months of Jesus' Galilean ministry, across the healings and the exorcisms and the Sermon on the Mount and the feeding of 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and every other thing that has happened in the region they govern and teach and adjudicate. They have watched all of it, and they have decided what to do with it. They have decided it is not enough. Not that it is unconvincing, not that the evidence is ambiguous, not that they are people genuinely confused about what they are seeing. They know what happened when that blind and mute man was healed. Their response, that Jesus was doing it by the power of Beelzebul, is not the response of people who are confused about the evidence. It is the response of people who have seen the evidence clearly and decided they need a different explanation for it, because the explanation that fits the evidence, that this man is who he appears to be, would require something from them that they are not willing to give. Pay attention to what the demand for a sign reveals about the person making it. The scribes and Pharisees have not come to Jesus because they are genuinely seeking to know whether he is the Messiah. Matthew 12:14 tells you this in a verse just a few pages earlier. The Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. These are people who have already reached a conclusion. The sign request is not an open inquiry. It is a trap dressed as a question, a demand dressed as curiosity, and underneath it is the logic of people who have decided that what they have seen so far is not sufficient. Not because it is not sufficient, but because accepting its sufficiency would mean accepting a conclusion they have already rejected. Here is what most people miss about the sign demand. It is not a request for more evidence. It is a request for evidence of a different kind, the kind that would make the conclusion unavoidable, that would remove the space between what is seen and what must be concluded, that would produce belief without requiring the cost that genuine belief always carries. A sign from heaven, something cosmic, something that cannot be attributed to Beelzebul or coincidence or mass hysteria or any of the explanations that people reach for when they want to be unconvinced by something convincing. Something that would let them believe without surrendering. And this is the thing that Jesus will not provide. Not because the sign is beyond his power, nothing is beyond his power, but because a miracle that removes the need for faith also removes faith itself.
Faith is not the conclusion you reach after the evidence has made the conclusion unavoidable.
Faith is the response you give to evidence that is sufficient but not compulsory. Close that gap with a cosmic demonstration from heaven, and you have not produced faith. You have produced something closer to compulsion than commitment. Jesus will not compel assent, he will invite it. Matthew 16 repeats the scene with different people and the same result. This time it is Pharisees and Sadducees together, two groups that disagree with each other about almost everything, united in their demand. They come to test him. Matthew uses the Greek word parazo, to test, to put to the proof, the same word used for the devil's temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. They are not inquiring, they are testing.
Jesus looks at them and says something devastating.
When evening comes, you say, "It will be fair weather, for the sky is red." And in the morning, "It will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening." You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. The most sign-literate people in Judea, the people who have built their entire professional and religious identity around reading the signs of God in the text, reading the signs of purity in the law, reading the signs of the covenant in the tradition, cannot read the most significant sign standing in front of them. The irony is precise and devastating. They are asking for a sign from heaven. The sign of the age is in the room. They cannot see it because they have already decided what they would do with it if they could.
The scales are fixed. And so he gives them what he gave the scribes and Pharisees in chapter 12, the sign of Jonah. Only that, nothing else. Why Jonah? Of all the signs Jesus could have offered, of all the demonstrations of power available to the one who fed 5,000 people and walked on water and raised the dead, he chooses to point to a reluctant prophet who ran in the wrong direction and ended up in a fish. Because Jonah's sign is the only kind of sign that does what Jesus wants a sign to do. The story of Jonah, as the people standing in front of Jesus know it, goes like this. God tells Jonah to go to Nineveh. Jonah does not go. He gets on a ship going in the opposite direction. A storm comes. He ends up in the sea. A great fish swallows him.
3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, and then the fish spits him out, and he goes to Nineveh after all. And the Ninevites believe him. That is the part of the story Jesus is pointing at, not the fish, the Ninevites. Because the Ninevites do not repent because they watched Jonah emerge from a fish. They are not present for that. They have not seen the miracle. What they have is a disheveled prophet who has clearly been somewhere very bad, standing in their city, telling them something they need to hear. At the preaching, before the proof. The Queen of the South functions the same way. She traveled from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, not because Solomon had performed a cosmic sign that compelled her to come, but because she had heard something worth crossing the known world to encounter.
She arrived. She listened. She was overwhelmed. Something greater than Jonah is here. Something greater than Solomon is here. The Ninevites got a discouraged prophet covered in fish bile. The Queen of Sheba got a wise king. And both of them responded without demanding a prior demonstration. The scribes and Pharisees have something greater than Jonah standing in the same room with them. And they want a sign from heaven. Stay with me, because the sign of Jonah is not simply about the resurrection as a future event. It is about the shape of the only sign Jesus is willing to give. 3 days in the earth, then out. A death and a return. Something that happens in the dark where no one can watch it, and only the result is visible to the people who were not there for the process. You cannot see the sign of Jonah while it is happening. Nobody witnesses the resurrection itself. The women come to the tomb before sunrise and find it empty. The disciples run and look and see the burial cloths lying there. The risen Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene in the garden.
to the disciples in the locked room, to 2 people on the road to Emmaus, to 500 people at once, according to Paul. But nobody sees the moment of resurrection. What they see is the result. What they receive is the testimony. They believe without having watched it happen. This is the sign of Jonah. And this is why it is the only sign Jesus offers to the people who demand one. Not because it is inferior, it is the greatest sign in human history.
But it is a sign that can only be received by people who are willing to believe a testimony without having been present for the event the testimony describes. It requires exactly the one thing that the demand for a sign is designed to avoid: faith. And now we come to the most dramatic refused sign in all 4 Gospels: the cross. Jesus is hanging between 2 criminals outside Jerusalem. The chief priests, the scribes, the elders are standing below him, and they say something that Matthew records with the particular precision of people who believe they have finally cornered their opponent. He saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe. This is the sign demand at its most naked.
No theological framing, no pretense of inquiry. The direct transaction. Perform this specific act, and we will produce the belief you apparently want from us. He does not come down. Pay attention to this, because it is the most important refused sign in the entire Passion narrative. He says in Gethsemane that he could call 12 legions of angels. The power to come down from the cross is available. He is not staying on the cross because he has run out of options. He is staying on the cross because coming down would undo the sign they actually need. The sign they are asking for, come down, demonstrate that you are who you say you are, would prove that he can override death. But it would do so by preventing the death. If he comes down, there is no tomb.
If there is no tomb, there is no sign of Jonah. If there is no sign of Jonah, there is no resurrection. And without the resurrection, there is no salvation.
The sign they demand would destroy the only sign that can save them. Paul sees this clearly. 1 Corinthians 1:22-23. Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. Not the sign the Jews demanded, not the wisdom the Greeks were seeking. A crucified Messiah, a man dying in public humiliation, not descending from heaven in glory. The opposite of every specification. The sign that has the wrong shape for every demand that was made. Not from heaven, from the earth. Not a descent in glory, an entry into the ground. Not 12 legions of angels visible to everyone.
3 days of silence in a sealed tomb where nobody is watching. And then, on the 3rd day, in the dark, in a tomb where nobody watches, he comes out, like Jonah. Now step back from the demands and look at who gets the miracles. Not the scribes, not the Pharisees, not the Sadducees, not the chief priests who stood at the foot of the cross and offered the conditional transaction. The blind man gets a miracle. The leper gets a miracle. The bleeding woman who crawled through a crowd to touch the hem of a prayer shawl gets a miracle. Bartimaeus gets a miracle. The paralyzed man lowered through a roof by 4 friends gets a miracle. Lazarus gets a miracle. The widow of Nain gets a miracle. Not one of them demands a sign. Not one of them says, perform this specific thing, and then I will believe you. Every single person in the Gospels who receives a miracle receives it in the posture of someone who is not in a position to set terms. The blind man cannot negotiate from strength. The leper cannot make demands. The bleeding woman does not arrive with a checklist of credentials she requires Jesus to meet. The Pharisees arrive with a conclusion already reached, a verdict already written, and a demand for evidence that would justify a conclusion they have already decided not to reach. They do not come with open hands. They come with scales, looking for the specific weight of evidence that would tip a balance they have already calibrated. The scales are fixed. Here is what most people miss about the contrast between these two groups. The difference is not status.
The difference is posture.
People who receive miracles come with open hands. People who receive nothing come with closed fists, demanding, testing, setting terms, requiring prior demonstration before they will offer the one thing they need to offer first. They come to receive evidence. They need to come to receive grace. And these are not the same errand. Pay attention to what Paul sees when he looks at this pattern from the other side of the resurrection. 1 Corinthians 1:22, the line that captures the whole theological structure in a single sentence. Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. Two groups, two different strategies for the same goal, arriving at certainty without risk. The Jews want a sign. Give us proof that compels assent, that removes the space between the evidence and the conclusion. The Greeks want wisdom. Give us a philosophical system sophisticated enough that we can arrive at truth through reason alone, without surrender to a personal God.
Both strategies are attempting to get to belief without paying the price of faith. And Paul's answer is, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block and foolishness. There is a difference between making belief easy and making belief possible. Making belief easy would mean removing all the obstacles, providing the sign from heaven, coming down from the cross, producing the cosmic demonstration that leaves no room for doubt. That would make belief easy, but it would not make it real, because belief that has no alternative is not belief. It is recognition. The kind of thing you do when you look at the sun and acknowledge that it is bright.
You are not choosing to believe the sun is bright. The brightness is too overwhelming to deny. Jesus is not after recognition. He is after faith. And faith requires choice. And choice requires a genuine possibility of choosing otherwise. And that possibility requires that the evidence be sufficient but not compulsory. Romans 1:20. God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Without excuse. The evidence available in creation is sufficient to produce faith. The healings and exorcisms and feedings and raisings that the Pharisees have witnessed across months of the Galilean ministry are sufficient to produce faith. The problem is not insufficient evidence. The problem is suppression, and more evidence does not fix a suppression problem. Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Not the absence of evidence, the response to evidence that is present but incomplete, enough to justify trust, enough to act on, not overwhelming enough to eliminate risk. The Pharisees want to eliminate the risk. Jesus offers something different, sufficient evidence, and an invitation to respond before the gap is closed. Now the pattern completes. The scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 12 have seen the healing of a blind and mute man and demand a cosmic sign. They receive the sign of Jonah. The Pharisees and Sadducees in Matthew 16 can read the red sky, but cannot read the signs of the times. They receive the same answer, Jonah. The chief priests and elders at the cross offer the conditional transaction. Come down and we will believe. He does not come down, because the sign they demand would destroy the sign they need. And 3 days later, in the dark, in a sealed tomb where nobody is watching, the sign of Jonah completes itself. He comes out, not for the Pharisees, not in front of the chief priests, not with a cosmic demonstration designed to compel the assent of the people who demanded one. He appears to the women who came before sunrise because they had nowhere else to be. He appears to the disciples in a locked room where they are hiding. He appears to 2 people walking away from Jerusalem who have given up. He appears to 500 people, and Paul preserves the list as evidence for people who cannot be there to see for themselves. The sign of Jonah is given to the people who receive testimony. Now here's what this pattern has to say to you. If you have ever said out loud or in the private space where you keep your most honest thoughts, if God would just do X, I would believe, you have made the sign demand. You have arrived at the same position the scribes and Pharisees occupied in Matthew 12. You have defined the specific evidence that would satisfy you,
and made belief conditional on its arrival. Jesus' answer to that request has not changed. Not X, Jonah. Not the specific sign you specified. The sign that has already been given. The sign that requires looking at a tomb that is claimed to be empty and deciding what you are going to do with the testimony of the people who found it that way.
The sign that has been handed down through 2,000 years of witnesses who have staked everything on the claim that a man went into the ground and came back out. You cannot see it in advance. You can only receive the testimony. But the testimony is sufficient, not compulsory, not overwhelming, not the kind of evidence that removes all alternative explanations and leaves you with no choice. Sufficient, enough to justify trust, enough to act on, enough to produce the response the Ninevites produced when a discouraged prophet covered in fish bile told them to repent, not because the evidence was irrefutable, but because the word was true. He does not refuse the elite out of spite. He does not withhold miracles from the powerful and educated because he has decided they do not deserve them. He withholds the specific sign they demand because he knows, with the knowledge of someone who can read what is in a person before they have said it, that more evidence is not what they need. What they need is the willingness to respond to what they already have. And no miracle can produce that willingness. It can only be chosen. The door is not closed. It opens from the inside. There are three things I want you to carry out of this. The first is this. He refused signs to those who had already seen signs, because the problem was never insufficient evidence. It was the unwillingness to respond to what was already there. The Pharisees who watched the healing of the blind and mute man and immediately asked for a different sign were not seeking truth. They were seeking a different verdict.
And no amount of evidence produces a different verdict in a mind that has already decided what verdict to reach. The second is this. The only sign he gives is the one that requires faith first. The sign of Jonah, the resurrection, cannot be seen in advance. It can only be received as testimony. Receiving testimony requires exactly what the sign demand is designed to avoid. Trusting something you did not personally witness, staking something on the word of someone who was there and found the tomb empty. That is the shape of the only sign, and it is that shape on purpose. The third, and this is the one I want you to sit with, he does not withhold miracles from the elite out of exclusion. He withholds them out of honesty. More signs would not help people who have decided what to do with the signs they already have. The Pharisees did not need a 13th healing to change their assessment. They had attributed 12 to Beelzebul. The chief priests did not need Jesus to come down from the cross. They already knew the tomb was empty, and they paid soldiers to say the body was stolen. They had the sign of Jonah, and they suppressed it. But the invitation is still open. It has always been open. The door is not closed for the educated any more than it is closed for the desperate. The Pharisees who asked for a sign and received Jonah could have done what the Ninevites did, received the testimony, responded to the preaching, believed before the full proof arrived. Some of them did. Nicodemus came at night. Joseph of Arimathea asked for the body. The door opens from the inside. The handle has always been within reach. If this video meant something to you, leave a comment below with the words, "The sign of Jonah." Just that. And if you know someone who is in the "if God would just do X" cycle, someone who has defined the specific evidence that would produce belief and is waiting for it to arrive, share this with them. Not to argue with the demand, but because the answer to the demand has already been given, 2,000 years ago, in a sealed tomb outside Jerusalem, and the tomb is still empty. We will see you in the next one.